September 30th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the Myth Information Conference is... It's a red carpet event with many special guests, and you are invited. The film caps the Myth Information Conference itself, which is an event unlike the typical free thought convention. The conference is about dialogue, bringing together diverse speakers, diverse perspectives, diverse attendees to promote reasoned and respectful dialogue about many of the hot topics in the secular community today: politics, religion, social justice, free speech, and more. Agree or disagree, this event is about the sharing of and the challenging of ideas. At Mythcon, you're going to see a debate about Islam between atheist Faisal Saeed Al-Muhtar and Muslim Asra Nomani. That debate's moderated by Matt Dillahunty. Thomas Smith is going to face off on stage with Sargon of Akkad. Presentations by former Scientologist Ron Miscavige, Melissa Chen, Shoe on Head, and Armored Skeptic from YouTube give their perspectives on skepticism and social media. And of course, the Batman and Jesus film debut and a VIP after party. I will be there, Aaron Raw and other activists will be there, and you can still get your tickets to attend the conference in person or for the live stream if you can't join us there.
Why is everyone having this is the crowd. This is the crowd. This is the crowd. This is what you want the movement to be. You want people to be yelling. This is what you want the movement to be. Organizers should be fucking embarrassed.
Hello, YouTube. Chrisiosity here. It's been about 2.5 months since Mythcon, and in our current event situation, that's kind of like 2.5 years. So I thought that now that we have a little bit of distance, we could go back and look at some of the things maybe that it taught us, maybe that it should have taught us, but didn't, and see what we can see. Mythcon, for those who don't know, is an annual conference put on by the group Mythicist Milwaukee, an atheist group with a particular interest in putting forward the point of view that Jesus was a mythical, not historical figure. This year, their fourth conference stirred up intense drama that brought together multiple atheist factions in a way that hasn't happened before, and also exposed some wounds that have been festering for a while. During this series, there's going to be a lot to go through as we discuss the events themselves and the issues that surrounded them, including the internal divisions in the atheist movement and more philosophical concerns like, what does it mean to be skeptical? What does it mean to be good without God? We're going to talk about some issues people had with the way activists comport themselves, and a lot more. Big topic. I don't pretend to be a perfectly neutral party. In a situation like this, maintaining perfect objectivity is not possible, but I will try to make my own point of view and perspective clear. You'll know it by the snark, and present things otherwise as fairly as I can. Before we can start, though, we need a little background information. So in this video, I will discuss the new atheist movement, its history of problems with misogyny and harassment, and touch on Atheism Plus and Gamergate, as I don't think it's just a coincidence that the Mythcon speakers included two major figures associated with Gamergate, and a man who's been known to speak of Atheism Plus in fairly histrionic ways. Well, if you're going to start ripping off band-aids, you might as well get right into it. There have been atheists for a long time, of course, but the social-political movement called New Atheism began in large part as a reaction to the attacks of 9/11, which directly inspired Sam Harris to write his book The End of Faith, to be followed in short order by books by Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett, among others, who became known as the Four Horsemen. There are, of course, other figures prominent in the movement as well, but these are kind of the four biggest thought leaders starting out. This movement had, and continues to have, certain positive aspects which should be acknowledged, especially in terms of public outreach and attempts to lessen stigma against the non-religious. New atheism has also been dogged by recurrent problems, and I'm hardly the first person, or the 10th person, or the 100th person, for that matter, to note that this movement is, demographically speaking, made up of largely mid to upper class white men who take a rather arrogant posture. They know the right way to live your life, and they're willing to instruct us all for our own good. The Attitudes of the White Man's Burden, which is a poem by Rudyard Kipling where he tries to convince America to become more imperialistic, for the good of all those barbarian peoples out there, of course, while being sure to ignore all their ignorant complaints about, being taken over by people, because the poor bastards just don't know any better. They don't understand what it means to be reasonable and enlightened and civilized. Well, sometimes these old attitudes, which die hard, they do seem to crop up in the rhetoric of this group. And if you try to suggest that they should be taking some care against that, well, yeah, they're not interested in that. In fact, should you mention that they seem to have trouble attracting people of color, women or other minorities, if they respond to you at all, they will respond to you by telling you how racist, sexist, and also really divisive you are for noticing the issue in the first place. Now, the events and issues of Mythcon revolved around gender more than race or ethnicity, and that is where I will focus in this series. The atheist leaders, with the possible exception of Daniel Dennett, have repeatedly been charged with sexism in articles and blogs, just too numerous to mention. So I'm just going to briefly run down some choice quotes from the past, since we're talking about how things came to be the way that they are. I've mentioned these in other videos, but it's worth going over again, starting with the suave Christopher Hitchens, who, as many will know, was never a fan of the Clintons, but he angered women in the misogynist way that he discussed Hillary, the way he framed language where he criticized her in very sexist ways. At various times he described her thusly.
If you don't show her enough appreciation, and after all she's done for us, she may cry. Flagrant, hysterical, repetitive, pathological lying. I just think that if she knew how it made her look, sort of alternatively soppy and bitchy, she'd stop it. But she can't help herself, can she? She just can't, Mrs. Clinton, looking like the dog being washed.
In his infamous article, Women Aren't Funny, the same Hitchens who famously stated that that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, makes a number of grandiose claims without evidence in this article. He believed that men are funny because they need to appeal to women. And as he writes, yeah, I caught that drift. Subtle, but I managed to keep up. When women are funny, and he admits occasionally they are, he has an unsourced explanation for this as well.
Most of them, though, when you come to review the situation, are hefty or dykey or Jewish, or some combo of the three. When Roseanne stands up and tells her biker jokes and invites people who don't dig her shtick to suck her dick, know what I am saying? And the Sapphic faction may have its own reasons for wanting what I want, the sweet surrender of female laughter. While Jewish humour, boiling as it is with angst and self-deprecation, is almost masculine by definition.
And here I had no idea that angst and self-deprecation were masculine specifically. I guess Patton Oswalt is this generation's greatest alpha male. Anyway, he goes on.
And because fear is the mother of superstition, and because they are partly ruled in any case by the moon and the tides, women also fall more heavily for dreams, for supposedly significant dates like birthdays and anniversaries, for romantic love, crystals and stones, lockets and relics, and other things that men know are fit mainly for mockery and limericks.
Now, I would argue with this one, but I'm too busy weeping over rocks because the moon's in Pisces or something. When Sam Harris was asked the question of why there aren't more women in new atheist spheres, he responded,
I think it may have to do with my personal slant as an author, being very critical of bad ideas. This can sound very angry to people. People just don't like to have their ideas criticized. There's something about that critical posture that is to some degree intrinsically male and more attractive to guys than to women. The atheist variable just has this... It doesn't obviously have this nurturing, coherence-building, extra estrogen vibe that you would want by default if you wanted to attract as many women as men.
And when women demonstrated annoyance at Mr. Harris's reductive statements and generalizations, instead of considering that a guy who's forever explaining to people that positive claims need to be proven and perhaps he should prove his own claims or admit that he can't, and in truth, The vigorous response he got could be used as evidence against his opinion about women not wanting to criticize bad ideas. Instead, he wrote one of his many tedious, self-defensive essays, this one entitled, "I'm Not the Sexist Pig You're Looking For," which right from there, it's like a perfect demonstration of how not to address these issues. The main gist of the piece seems to be that Mr. Harris loves his mama and his wife, so how could he be sexist? And that's bad enough, but the title itself, it's just so telling in its implicit blame on the women who are upset. They're looking for a sexist pig to be mad at, of course. It certainly wasn't his fault in saying sexist things about women, being nurturing, uncritical, and needing a soft, snuggly, extra estrogen vibe to be comfortable. Hells no, he was just the poor innocent sod whose head ended up on the chopping block because the wandering feminist mobs were out hunting for victims. It's this attitude, so prominent in New Atheist circles, that says it's always the fault of the women and the people of color who complain about their treatment that's the problem. These supposed skeptics never consider that the problem might lie with the treatment itself and the attitudes and people that enable it. Take the statement from James Randi, for many years at the helm of the Amazing Meeting Conference. A reporter asked him about the many rumors of bad behavior towards women, including having sexual relations with a woman who was far too intoxicated for consent, by one of their leading voices, Michael Shermer. Randi had this to say.
Shermer has been a bad boy on occasion, I do know that. I have told him that if I get many more complaints from people, I have reason to believe that I am going to have to limit his attendance at this conference. His reply is he had a bit too much to drink and he doesn't remember. I don't know. I've never been drunk in my life. It's an unfortunate thing. I haven't seen him doing that, but I get the word from people in the organization that he has to be under better control. If he had gotten violent, I'd have him out of here immediately. I just heard that he misbehaved himself with women, which I guess is what men do when they are drunk.
Now, understand that many of the misbehaviors that people have come forward to complain about had included accusations of masturbating in front of people, all the way up to groping, sexual assault, and rape, with corroborating witnesses. So to say these accusations are not violent is very troubling. Enter Richard Dawkins, who, despite his multiple criticisms of religions that cover up various abuses, was quick to offer up some really questionable defenses for Shermer as well. He could have gone with something reasonable, I guess, like people need to be adjudicated of guilt before we go assuming it, something like that, maybe, but oh no. In his tweet, he wrote,
"Officer, it's not my fault I was drunk driving. You see, somebody got me drunk."
And when that thoughtful statement was criticized, he responded in another tweet.
"If you want to be in a position to testify and jail a man, don't get drunk."
These problems, that of women being harassed, assaulted, not believed, and even punished in various ways for coming forward, have long been associated with the atheist movement, though to be fair, it's hardly exclusive to it. It's a widespread systemic issue in our society, in case anyone has been under a rock lately and missed what's going on in Hollywood, politics, everywhere else. The point is not to excoriate movement atheism as if it were alone in having these issues. But in all cases where these things crop up, people have to address them. That is part of what needs to happen. People need to figure out how to deal with them, how to move beyond them. If the atheist skeptic movement is going to do this, and if it wants to continue to be relevant in people's lives in our modern times, it's going to need to do this. It's going to have to get over its allergy to self-reflection. The kinds of issues that women were seeing at the time in the movement, and the fact that their concerns were not only not being addressed, but often women who dared to come forward found themselves bombarded by threats, accusations, general scorn. I mean, it's worth mentioning that Shermer was featured every year Tam happened, despite his quote-unquote bad behavior being a consistent problem, but the one time a woman referred obliquely, without naming anyone, to an incident that had happened that had been witnessed by one of the TAM leaders, well, That wasn't okay. She was out of there. Again, she's the problem. Anyway, this brought about various attempted solutions, one of which was called Atheism Plus. I was not there for this short-lived movement, so I have asked an atheist who was to talk about how it actually went down. And the reason I'm digging it up here, other than the armored skeptic having such strong feelings about it and bringing it up himself at his speech at Mythcon, almost any time, any suggestion that you make towards making the movement more inclusive or even just safe for people tends to get a chorus of cries of, oh, you want atheism plus, they destroyed atheism, horrors, fear, run. But try asking half of these people to tell you what actually happened in a factual sense, and you'll be handed a lot of gobbledygook about SJWs, Steve Shives, who had nothing to do with it, overreaching feminists that hate men, dividing the house of atheism, and that's it, no details. You might think such a horrendous event with such far-reaching consequences might have been more memorable, but apparently you'd be wrong. Okay, so unfortunately, the person that I asked to do this had some technical difficulties. This was Big Lundi, but he did send over his notes, and between that and what I've been able to dig up myself, I'm just going to give a brief rundown. So Jen McWright, who is a blogger on Free Thought Blogs, had sort of come up with the bones of this idea about creating a political group of atheists interested in social justice. They sort of worked it out in the comment section of the Blag Hag blog in August of 2012. This was coming on the back of Thunderfoot, complaining about atheist cons having to have rules and guidelines about proper peer-to-peer behavior. He had gotten into some meme wars with other bloggers, particularly PZ Myers, and was kicked off of Free Thought Blogs. Richard Carrier, PZ Myers, and Matt Dillahunty were the only really big name supporters of the movement. The idea itself managed to get to 3 phases, which was the logo, the message board, and sort of the overall point or mission statement kind of thing. Richard Carrier and PZ Myers were very non-diplomatic. Richard Carrier said anyone who didn't like it was 1 vote for douchery, got it. And PZ Myers called them asshole atheists. The message board community got very insulated. Matt Dillahunty originally didn't see the problems with the movement until he created a sock account to go on the message boards as not him, but he just said things that he would have said anyway, and he wasn't treated well. He still was sort of in favor of the overall idea. Many people who were in favor of social justice and in favor of atheism, but also thought that this was sort of not going well or this wasn't a good idea, were ostracized by the Atheism Plus community. And the community itself became very isolated, and the whole thing collapsed within a matter of a few months. There were a lot of people taking sides, a lot of people making YouTube videos, commenting, but they weren't necessarily involved. And some of these things I'm reading directly from Big Lundy's notes, so please note that. But he ends saying, all in all, the movement, if it could even be called one, got started on a comment section, made it to the message board phase, and collapsed before it actually ended up accomplishing anything, having a vast minority of community support from atheists in general in the first place. It was pretty non-threatening and silly. And thank you, Big Lundy. So that's what it was, but the more interesting thing really is the response. Atheists and skeptics treat this actually fairly inconsequential, if dramatic at the time, series of events. It's anyone outside of the atheist movement will have no idea what you're talking about, right? But it's often treated like the monster under the bed that you can scare the little atheists with if they start, I don't know, looking around and wondering why they have some of the issues they have with appealing outside of their demographic group. What we know from Pew and Gallup polls is that about 9 to 11% of people in America may say they don't believe in God, but only about 3% will call themselves atheists. I think that's gone up a little bit. And those who do call themselves atheists are by and large white, male, young, fairly well off, educated. The same old, right? Let's put that aside for the moment. The fact is that the things most people within the movement think about atheism plus are for the most part logically unsupportable. The kinds of premises that you're asked to simply accept when this topic come up are atheism plus destroyed or nearly destroyed movement atheism by causing a huge schism. This was due to atheism and feminism being incompatible with each other, and specifically with feminism poisoning, well, Thunderfoot would have said everything, but I'll be charitable and assume that was just hyperbole. But clearly the claim is that it's feminism and social justice ideas that are at fault. And then the conclusion is that anything that is anything like a progressive idea or concern is automatically just atheism plus all over again and must never ever even be considered. I would like to assume that the problems here are obvious, but I know better. So let's go to the basics, okay? Now I'm going to read to you directly from a textbook called Logic and Contemporary Rhetoric about cogent reasoning for a minute here. Reasoning can either be cogent or fallacious. We reason cogently when we have satisfied the following conditions. The premises of our reasoning are believable, warranted, or justified. Have evidence or are things we know to be true or something like that. We've considered all likely relevant information to the best of our ability. And 3, our reasoning is valid or correct, which means that the premises we employ provide good grounds for accepting the conclusion we have drawn. When all 3 of these conditions of cogent reasoning are not satisfied, reasoning is said to be fallacious. Okay, so having explained that, let's go to our premises. Atheism plus destroyed or nearly destroyed movement atheism by causing a huge schism. Well, we've already discussed how atheism plus didn't cause anything. All the angers, all the issues were present long before tensions were high. Atheism plus was in fact an attempt to deal with these issues. It didn't work, I don't think anybody would say otherwise, leading to premise 2 about atheism and feminism being incompatible with each other. This one is interesting for ignoring about a mountain of counter-evidence. Feminism and atheism have gotten along just fine together for a long time. Prominent feminists have often been atheists or non-religious people as well, and often spoke out about the ways that religion kept women and other people down. Also, secular humanists and other groups of that nature combine a lack of faith in God with explicitly feminist and social justice type ideals all the time, and they're fine, they're still going. So now we have a couple of dubious premises, which wouldn't lead to the conclusion anyway, even if we assumed they were true. Just because something fails once doesn't mean it will always fail, as evidenced by, human history. And a certain part of me, the one that hates badly thought out arguments on principle, has wanted to point these things out before. And believe me, I could go on for a while about why they're bad. But I never did because I didn't necessarily want to reinstitute the group or anything, so what was the point, right? But I was wrong to ignore it. I wasn't paying attention to the real effect of the argument. It was, in effect, an enforcement tool against ideas that went against the status quo, a way, intentionally or consciously employed or not, to keep the base assumptions about who the atheist movement was for and how internal issues were to be decided in place. Let me show you a recent clip from a conversation, not about Mythcon, but about an unrelated conference where YouTuber Noel Plum, Jim, is sharing his concern about a YouTube atheist panel that is made up of people, all of whom would fall under the progressive umbrella. So he's concerned about a lack of diversity of ideas in that panel. But listen to the way that he talks about this.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one thing that's interesting, because I know I'd watched a couple of hangouts that you'd had with Steve, and you talked about the fact that you'd grown up in the South. And one of the things a point that I've made, and I suppose you may have some first-hand knowledge of this, is that I made the point that with regard to atheist movements, that if you become too politically exclusive, that maybe you're not able to give the help necessarily to the people that need the help. For example, that you may have people that are in the position that you were in. I don't know how things have worked out for you with your other sort of socio-political views, but there will be people who will, their views on things like homosexuality or the status of women will be tied up with their religious views, and they won't necessarily lose all those on the same day. And that if you take a very hard, I mean, obviously take a hardline stance on behavior at a conference or whatever, that goes without saying, right? But a hardline stance on sort of what people you're prepared to associate with, and maybe some of those people that most need your support, because it isn't the atheists that are living in New York that need support, it's the atheists that are living in more religious environments, that maybe you're closing the door on the people that need your help the most. You know, a little bit like saying, well, we're going to give assistance to Muslim refugees, but only if they've got the right opinions on homosexuality or on Jews or something like that. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Muslim refugees or any religious folks. Other groups that do a lot of work with helping out people that are religious in bad situations. Nobody's helping out the atheists, so that's more of our focus.
Did you catch the base assumptions there? He talks about how religious groups treat women and LGBTQ folks, the misogyny, the homophobia, and those attitudes. And whereas someone like me, my first thought is, oh God, we should be concerned about the women and the LGBTQ folks who are coming out of these situations of awful abuse and have been told their whole lives how lesser and inferior they are. And the last thing we would want would be for them to come and find a place that's just like the one they left. By the way, I'm going to link an article about the hashtag Church2 movement, which I recommend people read and look at that hashtag, which is full of stories of abuse of power and rape, the hideous purity movement, which is just, yeah. But for Jim here, and I like Jim, I find him to be a reasonable guy who does try to be fair. But here's what I'm talking about. His concern, right off, is not for women or gay atheists who have just left these abusive situations. It's not how we can help them the most. It's not what's the best way to reach out to them, what's the best way to help them. Oh no, without a moment's consideration, he jumps to, we don't want to alienate these conservatives who are coming into the movement and not ready to shed their various bigotries. It isn't even a question. There's no internal debate, no suggestion of splitting up priorities or nuance or anything. It's just, well, of course that's what we should be worried about. Of course that's who we need to care about the most. We need to care about the bigots. That's the number one thing, apparently. And it's the number only thing. There's no thought to anything else or anyone else. And you may say, well, that's one guy. But no, it isn't. And in fact, like I said, Jim is the reasonable one. If you were to bring these concerns to many of the other YouTube atheists, you would be attacked. You'd be called a cry bully, or a collectivist, or a SJW, anything but seriously considering these issues and these problems that we've raised. Does anybody really have to wonder why movement atheism doesn't have a broader appeal? Why whole groups of people whose problems are just assumed to be not important right off the bat, or at the very least far less important than others? Is it really a serious question why they don't want to show up? Why would they show up? They've already been harassed. They've already been abused. They've already been told that they aren't worth anything. They could stay in religion if that's what they want. Anyway, so that was Atheism Plus. So now let's briefly review Gamergate, a movement in theory about ethics in video games journalism, but in practice a harassment campaign against women and feminists. Now, I'm going to link to Malmrose Project, another YouTuber, their excellent series on Gamergate from a sociological lens. It's a thinky series, but well worth checking out. For now, though, I want to show a part of one of their other videos because it kind of speaks to how atheism and Gamergate relate to one another and how it came to be that two YouTubers who came to prominence through their connections with Gamergate, YouTubers whose lack of belief was peripheral at best to their content, would come to be invited to an atheist conference. Now, they start out talking about the development of computers, video games, and the internet briefly, and how it originally started out as a more egalitarian sort of occupation, but over time became marketed to and then dominated by men, and the results of that. And they go on.
Then, one more major shift. The rise of social media and smartphones starting around 2005. There was MySpace and YouTube, and eventually Facebook and Twitter, and these websites and developments in technology brought with them an influx of people who had previously never been involved with the internet or kept internet usage to a minimum, either by choice, by circumstance, or by pure coincidence. The growth of the internet was, of course, gradual, but by about 2011, we had hit around 2 billion people using the internet, as opposed to 16 million as of 1995. This meant that the previously boys-only market that computer technology had brought with it would be a thing of the past by the 2010s. So what does any of this have to do with the skeptics? Well, simple. The skeptics are a perfect intersection between three subcultures: nerd culture, gaming culture, and new atheism. All of these things, as well as the skeptics themselves, have a lot to do with how hegemonic masculinity has been shaped by the rise of the internet. For those who don't know, hegemonic masculinity is whatever configuration of masculinity is upheld as the standard for men in such a way that maintains male dominance at the expense of marginalized groups, particularly women, men of color, and LGBTQ people. What this means is that the societal narrative of what it means to be a man is one that will favor a particular kind of behavior and ideology that maintains dominance over others, and maintains gender hierarchy over which cis, hetero white men have power over everyone else. An example of hegemonic masculinity, historically, has been football players in high school. To be a football player in high school is to be the proper way of being a man within that social circle. If, by contrast, a boy in high school walked around wearing a skirt, this would be seen as improper and the boy would be bullied for it. Hegemonic masculinity is specifically masculinity that runs on the logic of power and domination, and in this sense, it is better to be a bully than it is to be bullied, according to the logic of hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is not something that people actually really have, but it's something that men are taught that they should want. The stereotypical narrative is that men should want to be physically strong, sexually aggressive, emotionally locked down, and incapable of any sense of vulnerability. This is not something that anyone can be all the time, but it's something that men are pressured to be endlessly, and thus narratives are constructed that allow us to maintain the false image that this is how people really are. What I mean by that is that it's not actually possible to, for example, be emotionally impenetrable at all times. The problem is, if a man allows himself to be emotionally vulnerable, then this will have him susceptible to being victimized, and according to the logic of hegemonic masculinity, it's better to be the bully than to be bullied. So men, who are human beings capable of vulnerability and complex emotions, are forced to often reject these emotions and hide them and just pretend like they're strong all the time. There are a lot of problems with hegemonic masculinity, but the main problems are this. First of all, it's just not a good thing to want to hold power over others. That really is just being a bully. Second of all, it's compulsory. Men are taught that they should want to be bullies, and while a lot of men don't want to be, most men face consequences for refusing to strive for hegemonic masculinity. It's seen as improper to be anything less than hypermasculine, and since hypermasculine is actually unattainable, it creates the tendency to pose strong and pose dominant in order to avoid being vulnerable themselves. In other words, if men don't desire being a toxic asshole, toxic assholes will try their hardest to force them into it regardless. All of this coalesces into a second place is the first loser mentality, where being on top is the only viable option, otherwise you're portrayed as worthless. This is the world men are forced into, and it's a really bad situation that has consequences for everyone. When men, particularly straight white men, are taught that their self-worth can only be defined by being a bully, then the temptation to bully and harm others, especially marginalized groups, becomes way too prevalent. The problem, of course, is that being a shithead doesn't actually create a sense of self-worth because it absolutely fails to address psychological or personal problems. Again, given that emotional vulnerability is seen as a fault, attempting to improve oneself emotionally is stereotyped as being weak and, to a degree, even feminine. Women are afforded the opportunity for introspection, but men often aren't, and so it creates a cyclical pattern of trying to achieve self-worth through domination, followed by only fleeting sense of accomplishment, leading to attempting to again achieve self-worth through domination. Eventually, this becomes all too predictable. The skeptics relate to hegemonic masculinity because they have actually reinterpreted hegemonic masculinity in a way that is indicative of how much the internet has changed everyone's lives. In the past, it was the football player, the jock, the physically strong man who was the stereotype that men were supposed to aspire to. Now, in the wake of the new atheist movement, it's the intellectually strong man, the skeptic, the enlightened that men aspire to, at least in this particular subculture. The reason why I brought up all this history is because it's actually all relevant to how this shift happened. The rise of personal computers and video games in the 80s, mixed with the shift towards marketing games to boys, meant that a lot of boys and men were the first early adopters of the internet. These weren't just any boys and men, though. They were members of tech culture. Tech culture, of course, has intersections with nerd culture, which is itself a form of subordinated masculinity. Nerds are not the jocks. They are not the beacon of masculinity that are upheld as the standard. Nerds in the 1980s were not the bullies. They were the ones being bullied. But, like with any subculture, nerd subculture also brought with it a degree of masculinity issues from the men who occupied those cultures, and the gradual pushing out of women from gaming and computer science meant that by the time the internet came to prominence, a large majority of people spending large amount of times on the internet were men and boys who were part of a culture that was victimized by toxic masculinity during that time. However, within the early internet culture, there was still male dominance of the space, which led to replicating toxic masculinity within these circles, such as trash talking, trolling, harassing women and minorities, and maintaining a sense of anonymity that implicitly favored men above anyone else. The skeptics came onto the YouTube scene around 2007 or 2008, around the time that I first started using the internet more regularly, and during that time they were still part of the wave of new atheism, attempting to call for reason against the bigotry and easily debunked claims of Christian apologists and creationists. These guys were, to a degree, just hobbyists who enjoyed the process of logic and debate. However, they were also part of that very demographic. They were nerds, they were gamers, and they were atheists. These things were important parts of their identity in a time where the jock was still the upheld stereotype of what it meant to be a man, because these were things that displaced them from the mainstream. Christians were and still are the dominant force of religion in the West, and nerd culture was always seen as a sort of safe haven from the bullies of the world, and gaming was a thing by nerds for nerds. The male dominance that was prevalent in gamer culture in the early days of the internet eventually was strained by the increased popularity of the internet due to social media, and eventually, with billions of people using the internet and the many things that the internet are used for, including gaming, was no longer a thing just for nerdy guys. This, mixed with the hegemonic promise of being able to achieve value through subordinating others, particularly women, people of color, and LGBTQ people, led to the infamous Gamergate fiasco in 2014. People who were supportive of Gamergate often like to claim it was a rally for ethics in gaming journalism, but the more commonly understood conclusion was that Gamergate was an anti-feminist hate mob. This isn't wholly accurate, though. Gamergate wasn't just anti-feminist, they were anti-woman. Gamergaters didn't just want to keep feminists out of gaming, they wanted to keep women out of what they had seen as their spaces, specifically gaming culture and the internet at large. This is why Gamergate became so vile in their tactics. They weren't just trying to scare women away from critiquing games, they were trying to scare women away from showing their faces online at all. This has led to a political climate online in which a group of largely conservative white men attempt to maintain male dominance of all online spaces by bullying anyone who isn't like them or who doesn't explicitly cater to their viewpoints. The skeptics are important to this because the skeptics saw a huge sea change after Gamergate. Almost all of them, one by one, started being more openly anti-feminist, and the skepticism switched from debunking creationism to debunking feminism. This was almost exactly around the time Gamergate happened too, and I was there to witness it firsthand. Having been a fan of several of these skeptics, I saw a lot of them simultaneously make videos explaining that they were intending to switch away from creationism towards mocking feminists. I can't assume motivations for why this happened, but I can easily notice they were shifting priorities from one intersection of their identity, that of being atheists, to another intersection of their identity, that of being gamers and part of nerd culture, and implicitly, that of being men. Less than a year after this shift in the skeptic community to anti-feminism happened, the paradigm shift towards an intellectual form of hegemonic masculinity had become complete. It was no longer the jock who was upheld as the standard of what it means to be a man. Instead, at least in most circles of the internet, it was now the intellectual who was upheld as the standard. The thing about hegemonic masculinity is that, as said before, it's essentially a form of bullying. So in this sense, yes, the anti-feminist community on YouTube are bullies. That's part of the nature of hegemonic masculinity. They pride themselves on maintaining an image of manhood that is powerful and strong, at the expense of those who are weak. In an intellectual capacity, this is done through owning others through argument. If they can make others look stupid, that is the key to showing off that they are, indeed, manly. And so the skeptic community and their legion of followers have taken to harassment and bullying in order to appeal to this new image of hegemony. This gets to part one of why they all wear those fucking suits. I call it the rational flex. By interpreting the power of manhood in an intellectual sense, rather than flexing strong physically, they flex strong psychologically through argument and debunking. Even these terms have changed in recent years, with owned and destroyed being used instead of debunked, implying that making a more reasonable argument was somehow a power move rather than a diplomatic one. I call it the rational flex because they create an identity politic around being skeptics. This is a holdover from the new atheist movement that is still highly prevalent in the current anti-feminist movement, that being pro-reason and pro-logic is a way of framing themselves as already the victors of any debate they attempt to incite. If they are pro-reason, then it's only safe to assume by implication that those who they disagree with are somehow anti-reason. This is a form of poisoning the well by portraying themselves as already inherently smarter and more right than anyone they argue with. Granted, they now largely argue with feminists, it portrays them on purely masculine terms. The discussion is no longer about learning or developing or empathizing. It's about winning. This is the rational flex. Portraying themselves as smart, flexing as more rational than those who go up against them in order to make themselves look more intellectually strong and thus somehow more right. They wear those suits to imply that they are intellectuals, that they are smart and sophisticated.
All right, so let's summarize all this, bring this together, which is really setting the groundwork for this series by talking about the relevant issues going into the Mythcon event. We've touched on the way that the thought leaders of atheism had a way of speaking about women and feminists in pretty misogynist ways, how issues of sexual harassment and assault at conventions were mishandled very badly, how Atheism Plus was created to deal with these problems, and how the backlash against it have worked to maintain a bias towards hegemonic masculinity, and how that has contributed at least to a lack of diversity of appeal, and how the atheist and skeptic community over time started to drift away from atheist concerns and towards anti-feminism and other forms of reactionary politics, and developed communal standards within that are often dysfunctional and continue to maintain male dominance in their ranks. What we haven't looked at, but that will become important, is questions of ethics and how the movement handles moral dilemmas in lieu of the ethical systems provided by religion. I'm going to argue that right now it does so very poorly, and all the promises of good without God have so far been uncashed checks, for the most part, and of course that can change. But it's going to take a greater willingness to tolerate internal criticism and division, and better methods of handling these things. Well, as always, thank you everyone for going on this little journey with me. I hope we'll all find it interesting and we'll learn a lot. And as always, hey, you know you liked it, so thumbs up, and you know you want more, so subscribe. Bye!